What is a kid's show? If you say a show for kids, well then, points for being literal. But you're really missing the full meaning of the term. A kid's show is a show that's childish. These shows tend to be very light, having little substance or maturity. The storylines and characters are rather shallow, the threats aren't actually very severe, and the solutions are super easy, barely an inconvenience. That being said, not all shows for kids are kids' shows. The idea that a show made for children has to be insubstantial or immature is one I disagree with. In fact, many of the best shows for kids distinguish themselves by having a greater depth in both story and character. My favorite TV show growing up, Batman the Animated Series, is a widely accepted example of this. We are, therefore, making a distinction between a kid's show and a show for kids. Shows for kids are great, while kids' shows are poor excuses for storytelling. Now, to the topic at hand. None can deny that the Clone Wars TV show was made as a show for kids. The debate I'd like to bring in is whether or not it's a kids' show. The popular consensus is that it isn't. That, in fact, it's surprisingly mature, deep, and complex. As you may be able to predict, I don't agree with this sentiment. I've invited a few friends who also have this minority view to discuss what we think and why we differ from the vast majority.
Hey everybody, I'm your Alibi.
And I'm Emmy.
We're sisters who collaborate over on the channel I'm Your Alibi, where we react to and study the writing of popular media like the Clone Wars.
I'm also the mother of 2 young children, so I have that perspective to bring to the table as well. Thanks for inviting us, Carolus.
The Clone Wars show ran for 6 seasons from 2008 to 2014 and had a 7th season in 2020, has been widely praised as one of the pinnacles of Star Wars. The story and characters are often said to broaden the world, deepen the connections, and improve the narrative of the prequel trilogy. I've even had friends tell me that the Clone Wars was so well written that it made the previously unwatchable prequels enjoyable. Though a show for kids, the fans are adamant that it isn't a kids' show, but that its masterful writing, world-building, and characters have elevated Star Wars temporarily out of the slump created by the prequels. This is a very mature show which covers a range of serious topics such as war, slavery, loss, torture, and suicide. It handles these delicate topics with care and doesn't shy away from brutal violence or sinister tones. Whatever the Clone Wars may be called, it can't be called a light, shallow, simplistic, childish kids show. Yet, after watching the show, these were the exact words which came to my mind. Now, I know I'm in the minority, so let my friends and I explain what we think. As war is in the title, twice technically, let's discuss how the Clone Wars handles the severity of war. There are 3 aspects of war the show brings to light: the severity, the consequences of actions, and the nuance among the warring factions. There are certainly examples fans can point to when the Clone Wars gets brutal. Darth Maul's hallway scene in Season 7 is probably the best example, as a clone trooper gets beheaded by a wall panel. But other examples certainly exist. Adi Gallia being gored to death by Savage, Satine, Fives, and Jesse don't have particularly brutal deaths, but they're still notable and emotional, and many other examples could easily be listed. Yet we must remember that the Clone Wars has a total runtime of about 56 hours over its 133 episodes. In this staggering runtime, these cherry-picked examples are far more the exception than the rule. So, how does the show depict the severity of war most of the time?
Have you ever killed a Jedi? No, never. Me neither.
This nonchalance towards war isn't limited just to a few comic relief characters either. Most characters have a fairly cavalier attitude. Now, don't get me wrong, a sense of humor can certainly help get people through the brutality of war. But that's not what we're seeing here. We're seeing a relaxed and casual nature. We see jokes and smug lies turning the tides of battle. We see the stupid bad guys foolishly honoring ceasefires while the clever good guys grin and sip tea. This isn't coping. This is reveling. War isn't severe for these characters.
This is clearly shown in Ahsoka's attitude toward their missions. We see eagerness in her for the coming conflict, instead of reluctance. She complains about peaceful moments being boring. She acts like war is a fun game, cheerfully tallying up kills and getting upset when she's left out of the action. Even as the series progresses and she's supposed to mature, she consistently chooses an aggressive approach and easily shrugs off any adverse experiences. Really, all of them do. Despite being shot, burned, tortured, concussed, electrocuted, etc. over the course of the series, the main cast seems to carry no physical or mental scars from their experiences.
Legolas and Gimli tally kills as well, and while some may argue that The Lord of the Rings is too light-hearted towards war and lets too many of the heroes survive, that's not my stance. The difference between the banter of The Lord of the Rings and the Clone Wars is, once again, frequency. The cavalier moments in the midst of battle are very, very few in The Lord of the Rings. The vast majority of the time is spent seeing the brutality and intensity of war. In the Clone Wars, the proportions are reversed. Ahsoka doesn't occasionally make a joke in battle. She constantly relishes the conflict. Some may point out how the original trilogy can throw jokes in the middle of a war, but not only is this far less common in the original trilogy, it's also limited to specific characters in specific situations. Han is a comic relief character, and the stormtroopers are generic enemies. You will never see Luke joking around when fighting Darth Vader. Yet, in the Clone Wars, any hero can be seen joking around when fighting any villain. What's more, the severity of war rarely, if ever, impacts the main characters. As a semi-anthology, the Clone Wars has a host of characters, yet, as with other Star Wars media, it primarily focuses on a triumvirate of characters, those being Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka. The original trilogy wasn't afraid of having Severity mar their triumvirate of Luke, Han, and Leia, but the Clone Wars protects its most precious characters. But more about that in a moment. Many of the examples in the previous category can be used in this one as well. I chose to distinguish these categories because certain costs exist outside of severe injuries and deaths. These costs include refugees, poverty, grief, and stress. Once again, these aspects do exist in the Clone Wars, and fans can certainly find examples. Yet, once again, they are few and far between, with the majority of the episodes featuring the heroes merrily bantering away. I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with bantering heroes. I'm saying that bantering heroes make a light and cavalier attitude for a show, not a dark or serious one. Take the need for more clones as an example. There's a whole arc devoted to whether more resources should be diverted to the war effort or to basic needs. While Padme is shown as the clear hero, fighting for the needs of the impoverished, Palpatine clearly just wants to grow his military strength. No nuance is given. As nice as it sounds for Padme to say, "Let's not forget who we are while we're fighting," and "let's always make sure we help the poor," her mantras would sound very different if they showed the true consequences of war. Imagine if the show was truly dark. What if it showed the piles of dead, What if it showed the horrors of living on the front lines? What if it was anything like the movies about the world wars? While Padme gives her inspiring speech about not spending money on reinforcements, they could show the panic of a gas attack in the trenches. Padme's comment that it's not worth it takes a very different tone. Her humanitarian stance is much shakier when she's saying not to help the soldiers who are fighting to keep her alive. I'm not saying it's necessarily right to divert funds away from helping the impoverished. Getting your citizens basic human needs such as clean water is important, but so is staying alive. No, you can't stay alive without water, but neither can you when a droid army is coming to gun you down. I'm not saying I know what the right choice is in this situation. I'm saying the issue is much more complicated than this show ever dares to address. When Padme wins her way in the Senate, it's considered a heroic victory, and no negative consequences are shown. The evil Palpatine has lost, and apparently the front line is just fine without reinforcements. Huh, that was easy. I love it when tough decisions end up having a solution with no negative results. Or how about how, even when the main characters make bad choices, getting their soldiers killed, the episode quickly moves on and is forgotten by the following episode. Ahsoka never has to stand amid the corpses of all the clones she led to their deaths, nor is she tormented by nightmares, seeing the faces of those she directly and indirectly kill. No, the original trilogy didn't do this either. The original trilogy is fairly light on consequences as well. Star Wars as a whole is generally rather light. But that's not the point. The point is that fans of the Clone Wars pretend this show is very mature and cannot be called a kid's show due to how it handles the consequences of war. The truth of the matter is it's light fluff. There's nothing inherently wrong with light fluff. Light fluff can sometimes be refreshing. But light fluff should never be called mature. I'm not saying the Clone Wars needs to show the true horrors of war, but there are many levels of severity between heroic simplicity and true consequences. Let's look at the way the heroes negotiate as yet another example. Think about this situation logically. An enemy general begs for peace negotiations, and so you hold off the attack in order to spare lives. Then, during those negotiations, the enemy betrays your trust and defeats your army. What would you do going forward? The answer is simple. Never trust peace negotiations again. The next time someone begs for mercy, you don't give any. In real life, the actions of Obi-Wan and Anakin would doom weaker generals, as it would remove the possibility of a peaceful surrender. The Separatists would know that only total annihilation is possible. Thus, Obi-Wan and Anakin's deeds would encourage the Separatists to brutally murder tens of thousands of weak, wounded, and helpless soldiers and citizens. But Carlos, you say, you can't apply real-world logic to a fictional world. To that I say, exactly. If you're saying that, you've just admitted that the Clone Wars doesn't have realistic consequences. It simplifies the issue, and so can play this off as a clever strategy, even giving the audience a few laughs, all while ignoring the complex consequences which would logically occur. The Clone Wars dumbs down war in order to get a few laughs. That's my whole point. Let's get back to what I mentioned about the Clone Wars' triumvirate. What lasting consequences do they face personally? As Alibi said, they suffer various injuries, yet none of them are meaningful. The effects of torture can be forgotten in the matter of a scene or two. I'm looking for lasting consequences, things which stay with the characters. You know how everyone likes to make fun of A New Hope because Leia witnesses her planet being destroyed and yet is never shown grieving? Well, that's what the Clone Wars does constantly. Ahsoka loses a squadron, but by the next chronological episode, she doesn't even mention them. The same about losing battles, planets, and systems. It's all forgotten almost immediately. Like Leia, they're upset in the moment, but then completely forget it the next time they're seen. Where is Han being frozen in carbonite? The original audience didn't know that he'd be fine. They had to wait 3 years before they found out if he was okay, and it was a fight to make sure that he was. Where's Luke's hand being cut off? He's shown in a state of absolute defeat and, in the following film, recalls his injury and uses that to relate to his father. In so doing, he steps back from the edge where he almost fell to the dark side. That's a consequence with a lasting impact, resulting in character growth. Where is that in the Clone Wars? Ahsoka's exile? What happens to her in exile other than exactly what happened in the Jedi Order? While in exile, Ahsoka gets victories and praise with success after success. There's no need for changing behavior, suffering, or character growth. The side characters literally affirm her as superior to the people who misjudged her.
You might not think of yourself as a Jedi, but you act like one. Or at least how I want them to be.
She's right.
The most Ahsoka suffers is a change of scenery and costume. You'll begin to notice a pattern if you haven't already, as there are certainly examples of nuance within the Clone Wars. Yet these examples are very few and far between. And this area is perhaps where the Clone Wars falls the shortest. The biggest example of nuance is one I was specifically told to look forward to upon my first viewing. The episode, Heroes on Both Sides, shows that the Separatists aren't just bad guys, thus finally breaking from the black and white tradition Star Wars was stuck in. The problem is that this particular arc is one of the most black and white arcs in the entire show. Despite the title of the episode, the show fails to present any heroes on the side of the Separatists. What about Lux? The show is very clear that Lux and his mother are completely ignorant of what Count Dooku and his army is doing. Name a general or warrior from the Separatists who isn't a villain. I'll wait. Each one is shown as cruel, monstrous, and manipulative. Ventress and Maul may gain a sympathetic tone at one point, but that doesn't change their very cruel nature. Now, name a hero of the Republic. Every single name of every single general and warrior of the Republic can fit into the category of hero. The only exceptions are Tarkin, who is supposed to be evil because of A New Hope, and General Krell, who is a traitor. When Barriss defects from the Republic, she becomes a terrorist who kills innocent people. The message is clear. The only heroes are those who stay within the Republic. If Lux was fully aware of everything Count Dooku was doing, he'd leave the Separatists. He may not join the Republic, but he wouldn't be among the Separatists.
Not surprisingly, when Lux decides to bring a previously neutral planet, Onderon, back into the Republic, it's framed as him finally making the right choice. If anything, Onderon's previous decision for neutrality is framed as a bad thing. We see this as well with the Lurmen in Season 1, the Togruta colonists in Season 4, as well as with Mandalore. In each case, their desire to remain independent from the Republic, rather than being given nuance, is framed as simply opening the door for the Separatists and/or other evil factions to invade and harm the citizens.
This is not nuance. This is black and white. Separatists are bad guys. If any good guys are following them, it's because they're deceived. How is that nuance? Nuance would be saying, you can be a Separatist and a good guy. Why is General Trench never shown in a sympathetic light? Where is Riff Tamson's positive side? And why are the Separatist characters depicted as sharks and spiders, while the Republic characters are beautiful and heroic? They all appear sinister, dark, and as literal monsters. They're not monsters in appearance, but angels at heart, no. They're just monsters. Any child could sort who was good and who was bad by sight alone. This show not only lacks nuance, it lacks any form of subtlety. What about Palpatine, some may ask? Just as Dooku deceived the Separatists, Palpatine deceived the Republic. Thus you have a mostly innocent faction led by a deceptive leader. Yet saying that doesn't counter anything I've just said. Obi-Wan and Anakin are still heroes. What they do is still depicted as being noble. They are compassionate, caring, and brave. The Separatists are selfish, violent, and cowardly. Padme good, Palpatine bad. Ahsoka good, Pong Krell bad. What the good guys achieve is good, and what the bad guys achieve is bad. Yet the Clone Wars introduces third parties which are neither Separatist nor Republican, most notably Duchess Satine and the pacifist Mandalorians. Isn't that nuanced, as it's showing more than just two perspectives? Perhaps it's an attempt at nuance, but in my opinion, it fails.
Yes, Satine is a poor example of nuance through pacifism, as are the Lurmen in Season 1. First, the narrative misrepresents pacifist beliefs, taking them to a foolish extreme, and then, of course, frames this straw man as wrong. Pacifism is a commitment to non-violence, not a commitment to nonsense. But with the Lurmen, we see a denial of reality, ignoring the obvious separatist hostility, and a refusal to even consider self-defense, despite that they could use non-violent means to protect themselves, just as they do with the Mastiff Loans. As usual, the Separatist representative is pure evil, planning to wipe out the defenseless Lurmen as part of the testing for a new weapon. And the Jedi have to come to the rescue since the Lurmen would just let themselves be killed to maintain their false pacifism. Similar to the Lurmen, Satine holds an extreme view of peace, even refusing to harm someone who is threatening to destroy a ship full of people, and often scolding Obi-Wan for fighting in self-defense. But worse than the Lurmen, she is also a hypocrite, since she will frown upon Obi-Wan in one moment and then later shrug off someone else using violence when it furthers her own goals, such as the Mandalorian police and Padme in Corruption, Ahsoka in the Academy, and Corky and Bo-Katan in The Lawless. And though Satine preaches neutrality, denouncing the Jedi and Republic for their part in the war, she quickly rushes to them for help whenever she needs it, rather than turning to independent sources, her own alliance of neutral systems, for support. And ultimately, her commitment to extreme peace is again framed as foolishness, as without the Republic alliance, her people are forced to turn to the black market in order to sustain themselves, which leads to nothing but problems. Not to mention her main opponents, the clearly evil Death Watch, not surprisingly, are working with the evil Separatists to overthrow her reign. Later, Death Watch joins Maul's syndicate, which is also clearly evil, and in each case, the Jedi and Republic must come to the rescue of the Mandalorian people. Seriously, after everything Satine suffered trying to avoid a Republic occupation, Ahsoka bringing the troops to Mandalore in Season 7 is narratively framed as a heroic act, with Obi-Wan's initial resistance to the plan being framed as Jedi negligence and corruption. Where is the nuance?
As a side note, I believe the prequel trilogy is more nuanced than the Clone Wars. Now, it doesn't matter how the Clone Wars compares, as I'm addressing whether or not the Clone Wars is a kids' show, not how it compares to the prequels. Yet, as fans say the Clone Wars elevates, expands, and deepens the shallow prequels, I'd like a brief tangent to give examples of prequel nuance. Qui-Gon Jinn is nuance, plain and simple. His entire character is at odds with all established parties. He's certainly not aligned with the Sith or the Federation, but he doesn't quite line up with the Jedi either. He's quite obviously his own thing, openly defying them. The members of the Trade Federation, rather than being purely evil as they are in the Clone Wars, are terrified pawns of the Sith. They have some evil inclinations for sure, but they are far beyond where they wanted to be, so it's no wonder they fled to Count Dooku for protection. Count Dooku is also nuanced, as his allegiance isn't entirely clear. Obviously, he's working for Sidious, but he's also not afraid to expose certain truths which could potentially harm his master in order to gain himself allies. Padme is also nuanced. She's young and idealistic. She's smart, but also ignorant. She sees the warning signs in Anakin and in the Senate, yet naively pushes them aside only to suffer for doing so later. The Kaminoans are also a neutral party, just trying to make a profit. Yet in the Clone Wars, all of the above subtleties are flattened into black and white. The Kaminoans are part of the conspiracy, yet the Jedi somehow don't sense their treachery when visiting them. Remember, the whole point of Order 66 is that the Jedi wouldn't sense betrayal. If the Kaminoans did have that intention, why did no one sense it? Padme's just good and idealistic in this version, and her naivete seems to have been forgotten. Dooku and the Trade Federation are just evil. Mace Windu is purely ignorant rather than being cautious, and you could even argue that Anakin and Obi-Wan are dumbed-down versions of themselves. All of this is quite a lot and may deserve its own video, or even series, but perhaps my friends have a few comments to add to expound on the dumbing down of characters.
As you say, there's really too much to cover when discussing poor characterization in TCW. The heroes seem to have little motivation beyond being the good guys. The antagonists, even ones who are talked up as these formidable foes, are often laughably incompetent, even when facing opponents who shouldn't stand a chance. Pick pretty much any prominent character, not necessarily main, but prominent character, within that series, delve into them, just focusing on their TCW appearances, and there's not much substance. Some are better than others, for sure, but they're all lacking in one way or another, whether in dimensionality, consistency, etc.
Compare the triumvirate of main characters to those in the live-action films. As said, the Clone Wars has Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka. The original has Luke, Han, and Leia, and the prequels have Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Padme. How do these characters interact with conversions between light and dark? In the original trilogy, Luke is being threatened with falling to the dark side ever since he learns who Vader is. In his final duel in Return of the Jedi, he comes so very close to dark, but backs away. Then he converts the villain to turn to the light. And of course, the entire prequel trilogy is about Anakin falling from light to dark. There's moral mobility. Where is that in the Clone Wars? Barriss turns, but she does this off-screen, and she isn't even one of the triumvirate. In fact, she's a rather minor reoccurring character. What about Pong Krell? Again, his turn to the dark happened off-screen, and he's even more minor of a character. So, which of the triumvirate falls to the dark side? None of them. In fact, Anakin's fall isn't even foreshadowed. There's a vision, yes, but that's telling, not showing. We all know the important distinction between showing and telling in writing, and yet Anakin's actions don't show any progression from light to dark in the show. So, which of the main villains turns to the light side? Again, none of them. Evil is evil, and good is good. But look even closer. How many characters or factions disagree with their series' triumvirate of heroes? Though Han isn't always on board, the Rebel Alliance is in perfect agreement with Luke and Leia, so not much nuance. Then, of course, the Empire is the perfect antithesis of our triumvirate, so again, no nuance. Then there's Jabba. He's not in line with the Empire, but neither is he in line with the Rebels. The same with Lando. Now the Clone Wars has Maul and Hondo as equivalents, one an alternate bad guy, and the other morally gray. Then there's the Jedi. Though we may expect Luke and the Jedi to align in the original trilogy, they actually don't. Luke is able to expose them for their black and white mentality when they say Vader can't be turned, and that Leia and Han must be sacrificed or Luke will fall to the dark side or be killed. This is a great subtle nuance which adds a lot of depth, as Obi-Wan and Yoda are built up as moral and wise sages, yet even they are proven wrong about Luke and Vader. In the Clone Wars, this same subtlety may exist as well. Obviously, the Triumvirate doesn't see eye to eye with the Jedi during the show, culminating in Ahsoka's self-imposed exile. Of course, my friends and I have addressed how poorly Ahsoka's storyline is handled, but the writers obviously wanted us to see a moral distinction between the views of the heroes and the views of the Jedi. This is the same distinction present in the original trilogy, just not executed well. So credit where credit's due. The Clone Wars at least attempted some level of subtlety.
Yes, if we set aside what is actually presented and instead look at what the creators were trying to do, we agree that there are attempts at nuance. But I don't think that automatically means they deserve credit. While I never watched the movie, it was impossible to ignore the dialogue surrounding the film Cuties a few years back. The creator had intentions of making a coming-of-age story that addressed the pressure of hypersexualization that young teens feel. But many viewers felt that the product she created actually promoted the sexualization of young girls. So, does she deserve credit for her intentions, or does she deserve criticism for what was actually presented? I know there will be many differing opinions on that, but for us personally, and taking this back to TCW, I don't think that intentions alone give credit to something. As the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Each attempt at nuance in TCW, through poor execution, seems to enforce the opposite conclusion, that there is no nuance. In each conflict, even between morally aligned characters, one side is right, the other side is wrong.
I'd say both credit and criticisms are due. Intentions certainly don't count for everything, but recognizing good story elements and striving to include them is important. Some writers can't even do that. Still, the reality of the end result is, as you say, what is truly important. So whatever credit they may be allowed certainly won't overshadow or even balance their failed result. It's like a school test. If I have two students who fail their tests, one by answering every question incorrectly, and the other by leaving every question blank, I'll say they both failed, but I'll give the one who tried a sympathetic pat on the back.
That's a fair point. We don't want to stifle the desire to write with the fear of not getting everything correct. We're somewhat perfectionists ourselves, so we understand that struggle quite well. To add to your metaphor, though, unfortunately the student who wrote all the wrong answers is very, very popular, and others are studying his test answers in the hopes of following in his social footsteps. As you said at the beginning, many who have seen TCW praise it as complex and mature content, and we've been told on our channel that we should be seeking to copy its writing rather than critique it. Influence is a hard thing to quantify, but I think it is a factor to consider when it comes to the discussion of how much credit versus criticism a creator deserves. But yes, we agree that both are important to give where they are due.
The Clone Wars does indeed feature slavery, torture, and suicide within the show, but to say it deals with these issues is rather generous. The prequel trilogy also features slavery, but doesn't actually deal with it. Anakin and Shmi are shown to be slaves. Padme and Qui-Gon pity them and are indignant that slavery exists. Throughout the trilogy, Anakin is obsessed with controlling his own fate and rejecting authority, quite likely a result of his childhood enslavement. Yet this consequence of slavery is more inferred than told. The full reality and psychological effects of slavery aren't explored. It's quite clearly a simple "slavery is bad" statement from the movies before they move on with the narrative. And, well, the Clone Wars isn't any different. The slaves shown certainly have worse masters than Watto, but still, the severity is lacking. It's just a simple, oh no, look at these poor people. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this, but you have to admit it's a simplified perspective of slavery. Anakin begins to tell about his personal experience, showing the writers wanted to have greater depth. But Ahsoka undercuts his trauma with humor, showing the true tone of the show. The Clone Wars isn't mature enough to sit with a somber reality, but must distract with humor because the tone they're going for is light, humorous, and simplistic. This undercutting is apparent in their representation of torture and suicide as well. There's an unnamed character who commits suicide to avoid enslavement, but no character ever addresses this reality. They observe it, grimace, then move on. No character ever reflects back on the horrors they witnessed or experienced. Look at the characters who have been tortured. They're not permanently scarred, they're just hurt in the moment. That's what torture is in the Clone Wars, getting hurt. They show the hero, oh no, she's getting hurt, then the torture's over, and oh good, she's fine. That's a simplistic view of torture. Look at when Han is tortured. He's at least still in physical pain after the torture ends. That's at least a little better than the instant and complete recovery the characters of the Clone Wars make. Again, I'm not saying you can't have a simplified and dumbed-down view of such serious matters, but you can't tell me something is deep and mature when it treats literal torture the same as getting beat up. This is a story about war, and it features references to some of the most horrible realities of that tragedy, yet it doesn't treat them with half the severity it could. Well, of course not, some have said to me. What, do you really expect them to show that kind of stuff on TV? Not in a kids' show. This is war made palatable, made flashy, made fun, and even made funny. There's nothing wrong with having light-hearted shows, but this simply cannot be called mature. There are a few characters every now and again who show remorse for having lost something to the war, yet these are often side characters with little impact on the story. The clones are an obvious example, yet the best example of all has to be Obi-Wan losing Satine. This loss is the most impactful as it is one of the show's triumvirate characters who is losing someone. Plus, it is a well-established and recurring character who is being lost. The TV show realizes the importance of this loss and so devotes the longest time to this moment. A fallen clone may be referenced in a following arc down the road, but Satine is actually brought up more than once after her death in meaningful ways. And yet, still, the show doesn't actually ever deal with loss. I'm honing in on Satine as she's by far the best example of loss, and any criticism I bring against her can easily be applied to any other examples in the series. Now, the moment Satine dies, we see an appropriate reaction from Obi-Wan. That is, shock, grief, and changed behavior. From a story perspective, these are exactly the three elements needed to make a loss feel real. The last of those three ingredients is the most important. I may be very shocked to hear of the death of a celebrity. I may even grieve if it was someone I truly admired, but I'm still going to carry on as before. As long as I have a healthy grasp on reality, I'm not going to start lashing out in rage because my favorite actor died. I never actually knew the man, and he only had, at best, a tangential part in my life. Should someone I love die, however, my mood and even behavior may change as I struggle to cope. Depending on how integral that person was in my life, my very existence may be shattered. Thus, the behavioral response shows how strongly that loss is felt. With this in mind, you may see the fault I'm finding in this scenario. Obi-Wan's behavioral change doesn't outlast the episode. Even if you follow the episodes chronologically, Obi-Wan is perfectly fine once the episode ends. are we meant to assume that Satine's death didn't mean all that much to him? Based on his initial reaction, that doesn't seem likely. So, what are we to assume? The only other possible explanation is that the writers didn't want Obi-Wan's character to change. They wanted to keep him lighthearted, keep his jokes, or just didn't have the desire or skill to have him explore his grief. But wait, some may say, perhaps Obi-Wan is dealing with grief, just with silent maturity. He is a Jedi after all. This still has to be shown. Have Obi-Wan excuse himself to cry in a dark, secluded spot. Have him do something unexpected and completely out of character, like speaking out of turn to a master, then apologizing profusely. That way, we'll know that even with a calm exterior, he's brimming with emotion underneath. There are many ways to show a strong silent type grieve, but this show does none of them. Not exactly, others may say. You said it yourself. Bo-Katan brings up Satine's death and gets a visible reaction from Obi-Wan. Here, however, we must understand the difference between characterization and development. Development is what I'm looking for this particular example. I want to see Obi-Wan struggle with grief. Not that he necessarily needs to overcome his grief. Plenty of well-written characters just stamp it down. Any reaction will do, but no reaction is bad writing. So what? Obi-Wan does react. Well, yes, but only minimally and only in the moment Satine is brought up. Think about it. If Obi-Wan were truly struggling with loss, the mention of Satine wouldn't only be upsetting in the moment. It would be upsetting for days, possibly weeks to come. Yet, just like with the torture, once the moment ends, everything is miraculously back to how it was. This should be a trigger, a sore wound that would set him back significantly in his recovery. Yet we know it's not significant because nothing significant comes from it. He's perfectly fine in the next episode. So what do I mean by characterization? I mean that the real reason Satine is brought up by Bo-Katan is to further her character, not Obi-Wan's arc. After all, how could it be to further Obi-Wan's arc? Like I said, nothing comes of it and no further references are made. Obi-Wan is never shown spiraling, nor do we see him regroup and recover. It's not about his arc of grief because there is no arc. Mentioning a name and grimacing isn't an arc. Why have it happen then? It speaks of Bo-Katan's character. She's on a mission and doesn't care who gets in her way. She'll push whatever buttons she needs to do to get the job done. It also speaks to the plot. Obi-Wan's guilt is a good excuse for him to allow Ahsoka to have troops. Again, it's not about Obi-Wan's development, because he doesn't develop from this point. We don't even really see him beyond this point. The Satine arc is over, even if her name is mentioned. Nothing of Obi-Wan's character changes as a result of her being named. Thus, to say the Clone Wars deals with loss simply isn't true. It has loss in it, but it doesn't deal with it. And again, the prequels does a better job with this, as the loss Anakin feels at losing his mother causes him to go on a murder spree, which sets the tone for his second murder spree to prevent a second loss. I'm not saying the prequels couldn't have handled loss better. Obviously they could have, but they actually deal with loss. The Clone Wars has loss, but never deals with it. Rebels does, however. If you like, I have a video about that linked in the description. So, there you have it. The Clone Wars cuts out consequences, subverts severity with humor, lacks subtlety and nuance, and spaces any brutality out with a plethora of jokes and triviality. This is a kid's show through and through. There's nothing deep or complex. It's a very straightforward show. The plots are very black and white, as are the characters. Subtleties around characters from the show exist only in expanded materials such as the novels, comic books, and most commonly, headcanon, but not in the actual show. The characters as presented are obviously good or obviously bad. I do think the show was trying to be more mature. After all, it introduced mature topics, yet it either didn't have the nerve or the skill to follow through, as each topic is undercut or dropped instantly. It is a very light-hearted show with humor at the forefront. Children lead armies and become war heroes. They save their friends from monsters and single-handedly defeat impossible odds. It's a child's fantasy, not a mature epic. There are moments of maturity, yet to say these are representative is clearly cherry-picking. Yet those are my thoughts, but what are your thoughts? Leave your comments below. But for now, that's all from me. A special thanks to my guests for today. Emmy, Alibi, thanks for joining and sharing your thoughts.
And yes, thank you again for having us.
It was a great discussion.
Thanks for watching.